So now we are going to give you the introduction to CL4. So this course for the revision, actually introduction to CL4 revision, basically caters to students who are going to sit the exam in June and in June 2025. So now what we are going to do here is basically give you an introduction to the revision. So you may wonder what we mean by an introduction to revision. So by this time what we assume is that you have already covered the syllabus, you have already gone through the syllabus, but maybe due to whatever the reason you may not have been able to go through sometimes it could be you have not been able to go through the entirety of the syllabus, but you may have gone through some parts of it. Or else it could be the other way around, where you have gone through some parts and most of it you have missed out, or you have not been able to follow up the lectures, you have not been attentive enough, right? And now you are feeling that, you know, the nervousness that you will not be able to cover the syllabus and then face the exam. So we are here actually to help you pass the exam despite the nervousness. What you feel, the nervousness, you know, regarding your exam could be because you have not studied enough, you have not followed the syllabus. But that doesn't matter. At this point, what matters is what you are going to do right now, right? From this moment onwards, if you focus on studying, right? If you focus on studying whatever the area it is, doesn't matter whether it's CL4 or any other area. Here we are there to focus on CL4 revision. So if you can focus from now onwards on this revision, the revision that we are going to do for you, right? You will be able to pass the exam, right? I will tell that to you very confidently, because in the revision we are going to only focus on the highly tested areas of your syllabus. We do not have the luxury of time to go through each and every aspect of it, each and every subtopic, and discuss all of that in detail, right? Now this is the chance to identify the most tested areas of your syllabus and focus on those areas, be thorough with those areas, and ensure that you are equipped in such a way where you can face the exam with confidence, right? Where you are able to face the exam with confidence, right? Whether you pass the exam or not, that will be, you don't have to think of it right now. You can think of it later, right? Probably after you write the exam, you can think of it. First, you should think of writing the exam, right? Whether you would pass the exam or not after writing, that is not a consideration which you should have right now, right? What you should have, the consideration, the idea, the objective, the aim right now is to write the exam confidently, is to go to the exam confidently. The day before the exam, you should be confident that you are going to write this and write this properly. That will definitely that level of confidence will come to you only if you are thorough with the syllabus, right? Or whatever we tell you to study and be thorough, right? So now coming to CL4. CL4, actually there are several areas that are highly tested, that are pet topics of your examiner, right? So we are going to focus on those areas. The revision course is going to look at the past papers and basically analyze what sort of questions would come for your exam. So the areas that are generally tested are the tricky areas, I would say. They are not the easy areas which are straightforward, rather tricky. And sometimes they may combine different areas as well. So, this should be your starting point for revision. So, what is this? This is basically the syllabus, right? The syllabus of CL4. There are 10 topics. Each topic carries 10% weightage in your syllabus, so altogether 100%, right? So, this is your starting point, right? So, what are the things that you should have? This is the snapshot of your syllabus. You should know basically features of a company and corporate personality, incorporation of a company, debt and equity capital, directors, company secretary, auditors, meetings, resolution and company records, winding up, minority rights, companies limited by guarantee and overseas companies, listing a company in the Colombo Stock Exchange and other laws. Quite simple. At the outset of it, it's very simple. But remember, there are several subcomponents to each of these, right? This is just the umbrella topic. Now, when you see the topic features of a company and corporate personality, what should ideally come to your mind? What comes to your mind rather? You should remember what is a company, right? What are the main features of a company? Basically, there is perpetual succession, there is separate legal personality. Now, that is an important area, right? What else? There is also, other features of the company and maybe the different types of companies, right? There are different types of companies. There is private companies, there is public companies, limited by guarantee companies. Then also, you may remember articles of association, right? Then the objects clause, right? These are the main things that we discuss in the first topic of your syllabus. Then the incorporation of a company. So, in incorporation, we discuss the company name. What sort of things should be included in the company name? What else? How a company is incorporated. How the incorporation happened. What are the forms that should be submitted for incorporation? How many directors should be there? How many company secretaries should be there, right? And then where should you incorporate the company? It's with the registrar of companies. Now there is the the online portal is there, so incorporation is made very easy, right? The requirements for different types of companies at the time of incorporation would be different, right? So if you look at the forms that should be submitted, you have to give the forms for consent of the directors, consent of the company secretary. You have to submit form 1 with the signatures of the shareholders. You have to give a copy of the articles of association, right? So things like that. Then equity and debt capital, right? So under equity and debt capital, you need to know what are the different types of capital, right? How capital is generated. And this is a very theoretical area where we looked at the advantages and disadvantages, right? Advantages and disadvantages of each type of capital, right? And why each of these types of capital important to the company, right? So equity is basically the shares right? This is the shares, whereas debt capital is basically the loans, right? What are the advantages of having more equity, and what are the advantages of having less equity? So then when it comes to so these are the things that you must remember for equity and debt capital. So what we are doing right now is basically we are seeing what are the main things that you have to cover in each of these topics, right? So directors, company secretary and auditors. So this one, of course, you need to know what are the types of directors, right? The types of directors. Then also there is the qualifications, disqualifications of directors, right? Then who can be appointed as company secretary, auditors, and how they are appointed, right? How their appointment works, right? Then there is meetings, resolutions and company records. So this one, of course, you need to know what are the different types of meetings that are there, EGM, AGM, right? Different types of meetings. Then different types of resolutions. So there is special resolution, there is ordinary resolution, right? And then the company records, right? What sort of records that should be maintained by the basically the records are maintained by the company secretary. So the responsibility vested with the company secretary to keep the company records. Then winding up, again the different types of winding up. So there is voluntary winding up, compulsory winding up, and there is winding up by court, right? And the instances that this winding up happens. Also the requirements, whether for a voluntary winding up a resolution has to be passed by the shareholders. So that kind of the requirements. Then minority rights, remember these are shareholders, right? The remedies available with the shareholders for minority buyout rights under section 93 of the Companies Act, right? How the shareholders, the minority shareholders can request the company to buy back the shares whenever they are buy back their shares whenever the company is not acting according to is not acting in the interest of the shareholders. Then companies limited by guarantee and overseas companies. So overseas companies, they will carry out the business abroad, and they will have registration in Sri Lanka. So companies limited by guarantee are basically the companies which are established for purposes of charitable purposes, right? They are for charitable purposes. So for these charitable purposes, companies limited by guarantee are established. And the companies limited by guarantee usually have members. They do not have directors, they consist of members. Then listing a company in the Colombo Stock Exchange, you have to look at the CSC rules. There is a threshold. There is a threshold for listing a company in the Colombo Stock Exchange. There is a threshold on capital, right? There is a threshold on capital to list a company in the Colombo Stock Exchange, and they have to abide by the CSC rules. Then the other laws adjacent to corporate law, we discuss the Foreign Exchange Act and the Land Alienation Act, right? So these are the key areas that we look at. So if I write this a little clearly than this, So legal personality, types of companies, articles of association, objects clause, etc. Right? So this is the syllabus in a nutshell. Right? Okay, so this is a detailed version of what is included in each of your lessons. So lesson 1, right? So law governing companies in Sri Lanka, you need to identify the law, which is the Companies Act. Then the general features of a company, of course, there has to be separate legal personality. So the incorporation will give separate legal personality to the company and the stakeholders, its shareholders and the directors. Right? Then if I just pinpoint the important aspects of this. So of course the concept of corporate personality is one thing that you can be tested, right? And the legal consequences of it. There are certain cases that you must remember for the concept of corporate personality. And then you need to know the veil of incorporation. By lifting the veil of incorporation only, those who are behind the decisions of the company can be held liable. So that would most likely be the directors, right? Yes, in lesson number 2, right, the different types of companies. Of course, you need to know the private companies, public companies, limited by guarantee companies. Different types of companies. Then the process. Remember, I said you have to first select a name, right? The name cannot contain the words Ministry, Sri Lanka, right? If those terms are contained in the name of the company, you need special approval of the registrar of companies. Then the forms that you require are basically Form 18, 19, Articles of Association and Form 1. Right? And then if there is so those are the main things that you must remember. So again, you need to be very thorough with the Articles of Association, because the articles under 1982 Companies Act required objects clause, but not anymore. So the objects clause as to what the purpose the company is going to engage in will not be included in the Articles of Association. So the company contracts would be pre-incorporation contracts. So you need to know what are these pre-incorporation contracts. So the word itself gives you the meaning, that is the contracts that are entered into by the promoters of the company with third parties before the company is incorporated. Then after the company is incorporated, the directors have to ratify the pre-incorporation contracts. And upon ratification, the contracts will be enforceable by the third parties against the company directors or against the company. And upon this ratification, right, the promoters may be held criminally or civil. There can be civil or criminal liability based on the ratification of the pre-incorporation contract, right? So those are the main aspects you should remember in relation to lesson number 2. So lesson number 3, basically you need to know what are the different types of shares and what are the rights that the shareholders will receive based on the different types of shares. So there are different types of shares such as ordinary shares, preference shares, redeemable shares, and each of those types will have different characteristics. And what are the rights and obligations of a shareholder? The shareholder will always get the right to vote. The right to vote will be proportionate to the number or the percentage of shares that the shareholder owns. Then also the shareholders get the right to vote at a shareholder meeting. Then distributions and dividends. So dividends are basically if the income of the company is more than its the expenses, right? The dividends have to be declared by the company and they are given to the shareholders. Then solvency test is always the assets of the company have to be more than the liabilities and stated capital. Assets have to be more than the liabilities plus the stated capital, right? So major types of share dealings, the major transactions always have to be ratified by the shareholders. So the major transactions are basically if by a transaction the assets would go beyond half, more than half of the existing assets, right? If the number of assets after a major transaction goes beyond more than half of the assets. If the liabilities after a particular transaction, major transaction, goes beyond half of the liabilities, right? Then it is a major transaction which has to be which has to be allowed by way of a resolution, a passed resolution by the shareholders. Then debt capital, you need to know the what are the advantages, disadvantages of debt capital. Obviously, if there is more debt, then at the time of winding up, all that debt has to be paid first, right? And it's a must to pay back, unlike in equity capital, where equity capital doesn't always require dividends to be paid, whereas debt capital always has an interest to be paid. Then the rights of shareholders and debenture holders. Then in lesson number 4, we have the role of director. So directors' duties, responsibilities, the qualifications, disqualifications, all that is set out in the Companies Act. The role of the secretary, of course, the secretary also has to be a chartered secretary or an attorney at law who has the license to practice as a secretary. Then auditor, of course, the auditors are of two types, external and internal auditors. They have to carry out an audit each year. And the auditors are always appointed at the AGM by the shareholders. So then the meetings, resolutions and company records, again, meetings and resolutions is a highly tested area in your syllabus, in your paper. So the different types of meetings are, of course, AGM, EGM. AGM is the annual general meeting. EGM is the extraordinary general meeting. So whenever there is a necessity to call the shareholders, apart from, after the annual general meeting and before the next annual general meeting, an EGM can be called. So different types of resolutions, of course, there are ordinary resolutions and there are special resolutions. If there is an ordinary resolution, right, ordinary resolution, it only requires 50% of shares in favor. Whereas if it is a special resolution, it requires 75% of shares of shareholding to agree. And if it is a resolution in lieu of a meeting, resolution in lieu of meeting, it requires 85% to agree, right? So it can be a circular resolution or a resolution in lieu of meeting. So company records always should be maintained by the company secretary, and whatever the records that needs to be communicated, whatever the decisions taken by the company, the important decisions that can affect the business of the company, has to always be informed to the registrar of companies, right? Then winding up, of course, we already discussed the differentiation between compulsory and voluntary winding up. You need to know, voluntary is always the shareholders agree for the winding up by way of a resolution. Compulsory is if the company is going bankrupt, it is made compulsory with the intervention of the court. So minority rights, again, the remedies available for minority, of course, oppression and mismanagement if the company has been mismanaged, and if the minority shareholders have been oppressed by the majority shareholders, they can go to court under section 224 and section 225 of the Companies Act. So minority buyout rights is basically where if the company is not acting, is not safeguarding the rights of the minority shareholders, then of course the minority shareholders can ask the company to buy back their shares. So that's what you call as minority buyout rights. Then there is derivative action where the shareholders can go to court if the directors or any other stakeholders are acting against the interests of the company. So they derive the power of the company and go to court on behalf of the company. Then of course there are restraining orders and interim orders where the shareholders, if they know that the directors are going to take an action, a decision that is going to be detrimental to the company. For example, if they are going to say okay to give the go ahead for an amalgamation, right, for a merger which will be unfair or which would be useless for the company in future, then they can, the shareholders can go to court and get a restraining order or an interim order, right? Then in lesson 8, these are the two things that we are going to consider. Basically, the company is limited by guarantee, and then there is overseas companies. So basically, like I told you, companies limited by guarantee are for charitable purposes. It's a must to have a company secretary at all times, and there has to be 2 directors. They have to submit the annual returns within a year's time. Overseas companies are basically, they carry out business overseas, not in Sri Lanka, but they are registered in Sri Lanka. So in order to be registered in Sri Lanka, they have to give the financial statements, right, the documents of the company have to be submitted to the registrar of companies in Sri Lanka. Then listing in the Colombo Stock Exchange, you have to follow the CSE listing rules. Then basically another area that is tested frequently is the advantages and disadvantages of listing. So what are the advantages? Advantages is, of course, you can expand the share capital of the company. You can have more, more people, rather more shareholders, right? The stake is more and the recognition is more. But the disadvantages is, of course, there is more rules that rules, procedures, regulations that the company has to follow because of listing, right? Then the process of listing, there are 2 boards, the main board and the divisory board, which divisory board. Divisory board is mainly there for small stakeholders, small and medium scale businesses who can list themselves in the Colombo Stock Exchange. And of course there is more focus on corporate governance as well. You will come across corporate governance because certain principles in the there is a section, I think section 9 on corporate governance, which is in the CSC listing rules. So they dictate how many non-executive directors, how many independent directors should be there if there are a non-executive director. So 2/3 of non-executive directors have to be independent. So there are certain regulations, rules of that nature where the listed companies have to adhere to. So those are corporate governance aspects. And there has to be committees like the audit committee, risk committee. The audit committee has to be headed by an independent director. Then there is risk committee, there is related party transaction committees that the CSC listing rules dictate for the listed companies to follow. Then of course the last lesson we have focused on the Foreign Exchange Act number 12 of 2017, and then there is Land Restriction on Alienation Act number 38 of 2014. So under the Foreign Exchange Act number 12 of 2017, so this one you have to, so the foreigners, right, this is in relation to the inward investment accounts and outward investment accounts, right? How a company, if they want to send currency outside from Sri Lanka to another foreign country, then they need to have an outward investment account. If it is they are bringing foreign exchange from outside to Sri Lanka, so that is an inward investment account, right? And then under the Land Restriction on Alienation Act, a foreigner cannot own, a foreign national cannot own land in Sri Lanka. So the same thing applies to companies. So if a company is buying land and if the company is owned by a foreigner solely, the sole director is a foreigner, then that company cannot own land. Ideally, actually in Sri Lanka, the foreigners cannot incorporate companies only by themselves. So always the foreigners get a maximum of 49% shareholding, whereas the locals get 51%, right? So the same thing applies to the lands in Sri Lanka. The foreign, let's say it's an offshore company, they cannot own land in Sri Lanka. It has to be this kind of a shareholding percentage for ownership of land in Sri Lanka. So every 6 months the company secretary of the company that has purchased land has to give rather give a notice to the registrar of companies stating that this shareholding percentage is maintained in the company. So these are the main areas and concepts that you need to know under this the revision as I've covered already in CL4. So if you know these areas thoroughly, I think that is more than enough for you to go and face the exam successfully. Because in your paper, so if I give you a brief idea of how your paper is structured. So basically you have 10 MCQs, which is a must to answer. Then there is 4 questions. They're like problem questions, right, which require short answers, right, not very lengthy answers, which require short answers. Then there is 2 more questions, right, 2 more questions which are more like essay type questions. It's actually a combination of essay type and short answers, right, which you have to answer. All these questions are compulsory. So this will carry 20 to 20, 40 marks. This will carry another 40 marks. So 4 into 10. This one 20 into 2. Then there is 20 marks here, 2 marks for each MCQ. So this is how your paper is structured. So make sure that you answer all these because all of them are compulsory. So don't miss out on any single question, right? Double check after you have answered your paper, double check whether you have answered all questions, right? So this is the snapshot of the revision introductory session, and what we are going to do in the next revision classes is that we are going to go through the past papers, because the past papers will give you an idea as to what sort of questions and what are the highly tested areas. So we need to focus on the past papers and then figure out the potential areas that can be tested in your paper. So this is the introduction to CL4 revision. Thank you.